Burkina Faso stands at a consequential juncture, a place where the weight of history meets the urgency of the present and the present of a people intent on reclaiming agency over their future. In recent years, national discourse has coalesced around the themes of sovereignty, security, economic self-reliance, social cohesion, and regional realignment. The emergence of new leadership has accelerated these debates, recasting them as a program of action. That program has inspired fervent support among many who see in it a restoration of pride and purpose, and it has attracted searching scrutiny from those who warn of the inherent risks that accompany rapid transformation undertaken amid conflict. It is essential to examine both forces at play, the promises and the perils, the progress and the pitfalls, so that the nation's pursuit of renewal proceeds with eyes open, guided by evidence, and anchored in the well-being of its citizens. The first pillar of national renewal is sovereignty in the broadest sense of the term. In security affairs, Burkina Faso has sought to reorganize and re-energize its defensive posture against the Islamist insurgencies that have devastated communities, disrupted economic life, and strained the social fabric since the mid-2010s. That reorganization has included the expansion of auxiliary forces alongside the army and gendarmerie, as well as intensified recruitment for the regular military. Supporters argue that these measures were necessary to rapidly increase manpower and presence across vulnerable territories. Critics, meanwhile, have noted serious allegations of abuses and the risks inherent in arming large numbers of irregulars during a complex internal conflict, warning that the benefits of numerical growth must be balanced by rigorous training, accountability, and integration with professional forces. These concerns are not academic, they are derived from reporting by independent organizations and conflict monitors, and they require sustained policy attention if tactical gains are to translate into durable security. The operational reality on the ground remains arduous. Insurgent groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have demonstrated a capacity to mass forces and conduct coordinated assaults on both military positions and civilian centers, testing defensive lines and disrupting logistical routes. In such an environment, the state's legitimacy turns not only on its ability to repel attacks, but also on its commitment to protect civilians without discrimination, to restore basic services promptly after operations, and to communicate transparently about risks, losses, and lessons learned. The effectiveness of security policy, therefore, cannot be measured solely by the number of fighters recruited or the tally of operations conducted. It must be assessed by the degree to which communities regain freedom of movement, traders reopen markets, children return to school, and displaced families can safely go home. Sovereignty also extends to diplomacy and regional integration. Burkina Faso has joined with neighboring transitional governments in Mali and Niger to establish the Alliance of Sahel States, a confederal initiative that seeks collective security, economic integration, and policy coordination. The alliance has taken notable steps toward institution building, from unveiling a confederal flag to announcing a development bank designed to mobilize financing on terms aligned with national priorities. It has also signaled ambitions in agriculture and energy harmonization, along with discussions about monetary arrangements that would reduce external dependency. Whether these initiatives deliver immediate material gains or unfold incrementally over several years, their unifying theme is the pursuit of autonomy, the capacity to set and execute regional agendas without undue external pressure. For Burkina Faso, success will depend on cultivating technical depth inside institutions, balancing shared sovereignty with national interests, and ensuring that regional solidarity enhances, rather than eclipses, accountability to its own citizens. This regional realignment has unfolded alongside a reconfiguration of relationships with international partners. One emblematic development has been a civil nuclear cooperation agreement concluded with Russia in mid-2025. The agreement envisions collaboration on peaceful applications of nuclear technology, infrastructure development, training, and regulatory standards. Advocates highlight the potential to expand electricity access, support industry, modernize medicine through radioisotopes, and strengthen scientific capacity. Skeptics, in turn, caution that nuclear projects require painstaking regulatory maturity, long-term financial commitments, grid readiness, and careful sequencing with renewables and conventional power sources. The strategic question for Burkina Faso is how to translate framework agreements into feasible, bankable, and safe projects that complement a diversified energy mix and deliver affordable, reliable power where it is most needed. Sovereignty in the economic sphere has been most visible in the mining sector, the backbone of Burkina Faso's export earnings. The government has moved to increase national control over industrial gold assets through revisions to the mining code, the creation or empowerment of state participation vehicles, and the transfer or nationalization of certain operations. Proponents want to find out argue that these measures correct historical imbalances, raise the local share of resource rents, and finance development under conditions of external stress. They also contend that closer national oversight can improve environmental compliance, local procurement, and community development agreements. Detractors warn of investment flight, reduced exploration, operational inefficiencies, and the fiscal strain that can arise when the state assumes the risks previously borne by private firms. The policy challenge is to design a mining regime that attracts competent operators while securing fair value for citizens, codifying transparency in licensing and revenue flows, enforcing social and environmental standards, and ring-fencing gold revenues for priority investments in security, health, education, and infrastructure. Economic self-reliance requires more than extracting value from the subsoil. It demands a deliberate strategy to grow the real economy, above ground. Agriculture merits pride of place in such a strategy. As climate variability intensifies and insecurity disrupts traditional patterns of cultivation and trade, the state's role is to de-risk farming, stabilize input supply, secure rural roads, and support storage, processing and market access. Regional seed initiatives and food security compacts under the Sahel Confederation can be leveraged to expand the use of resilient varieties and disseminate agronomic know-how adapted to local conditions. But the decisive factor remains policy execution at scale, ensuring that young farmers can access land and credit, that women farmers are not excluded from extension services or cooperatives, and that pastoralists and agropastoralists are integrated into conflict-sensitive land management frameworks that reduce competition over scarce resources. These investments may not draw the same headlines as high-profile resource deals, yet they are the bedrock of poverty reduction and national cohesion. No program of national renewal can succeed without attention to the institutions that safeguard rights and mediate power. In the context of counterinsurgency operations and emergency measures, it is especially important to uphold the laws of armed conflict, protect children, and preserve civic space for journalists, human rights defenders, faith leaders, and community organizers. The international record includes serious allegations of abuses by both insurgent actors and state-aligned forces, and the state's response to such allegations influences not only its diplomatic standing but also its credibility with communities, whose cooperation is indispensable to defeating insurgency. A confident and sovereign state can engage substantively with independent reporting, correct inaccuracies where they exist, investigate violations where they occur, and communicate reforms designed to prevent recurrence. The strategic end state is not merely the absence of violence but the presence of justice, which binds citizens to their institutions in durable ways. Governance under a transitional charter presents additional complexities. Extraordinary times have justified extraordinary arrangements, from emergency security measures to the composition of a transitional legislature, yet the long-term legitimacy of the state depends upon a credible pathway back to fully civilian, constitutional order, capable of delivering stability without permanent militarization of politics. This trajectory must be paced by conditions on the ground, to be sure, but it must also be articulated clearly enough to reassure citizens that exceptional powers will not become ordinary practice. A disciplined approach to transitional governance would prioritize measurable benchmarks, the reestablishment of state services in liberated areas, the demobilization or professionalization of auxiliaries, judicial capacity to handle crimes, electoral preparations that are meaningful rather than merely ceremonial, and administrative reforms that outlast any single government. Within this architecture of renewal, the social sector is not an afterthought. It is the hinge on which security and prosperity turn. Education systems disrupted by violence must be reckoned quickly to prevent the loss of an entire cohort of learners. Where schools are unsafe, alternative delivery models, temporary learning spaces, community schools with security perimeters, radio or digital instruction where feasible should be mobilized. Health systems require similar attention, both for routine care and for the psychosocial needs of communities traumatized by conflict. The dividends of macro-level initiatives will be judged by whether mothers can access clinics, whether vaccines reach remote villages, whether water points function through the dry season, and whether adolescents see real prospects for dignified work that keep them in school longer and out of predatory networks. Economic dignity also depends on urban policy. The capital and secondary cities have absorbed large numbers of internally displaced people, creating pressures on housing, sanitation, and informal labor markets. Thoughtful planning can turn crisis into opportunity by regularizing informal settlements, upgrading services, and connecting small entrepreneurs to microfinance and training that enable them to formalize and grow. Public works programs, if designed with transparency and labor standards, can build or rehabilitate the roads, drainage, markets, and clinics that cities need while injecting incomes into households on the brink. Such programs are most effective when they are tied to objective needs assessments and when local communities help set priorities and monitor delivery. A new foreign policy posture broadens the range of partners with whom Burkina Faso engages. Diversification can be a strength if it secures technology transfer, local capacity building, and fair commercial terms. Energy agreements, for instance, should come bundled with training for engineers, scholarships for nuclear regulators and grid planners, and joint research that seeds a national cadre of experts. Mining contracts should include verifiable commitments to local procurement and workforce development, monitored by independent mechanisms that publish compliance metrics. Security cooperation should be evaluated by outcomes that matter to citizens, reductions in attacks, safe corridors for commerce, and the humane treatment of detainees consistent with international law. Diversification becomes vulnerability when it substitutes one form of dependency for another, or when opaque deals corrode public trust. The strategic horizon is a Burkina Faso that can bargain from a position of competence, not desperation. Communication. It is a strategic asset in its own right. In an age of information warfare, narratives can fortify morale or sow division. The state's responsibility is to communicate responsibly and consistently, avoiding both triumphalism and fatalism. It must neither minimize the suffering that communities endure nor sensationalize it to justify excess. Clear channels between the center and the periphery prefects, mayors, traditional leaders, women's associations, youth groups allow the government to hear early warnings, adjust policies in real time, and explain the rationale for difficult decisions. This is especially important when measures undertaken for security or economic reasons have near-term costs for certain groups. Transparency helps distribute those costs fairly and mitigates the risk of grievance cycles that insurgents exploit. Revitalizing the justice sector is essential to consolidating security gains. Prosecutions for grave crimes must proceed credibly, regardless of the perpetrator's affiliation. Transitional justice options, where appropriate, can complement formal prosecutions, offering truth-telling and reparations that acknowledge victims' suffering and facilitate social repair. Prisons must be secure and humane, and court systems must be equipped to process cases without inordinate delay. Reform momentum in this area not only satisfies international expectations, it responds to a deep domestic yearning for fairness that predates the conflict and will outlast it. Fiscal reform is the quiet engine that converts ambition into outcomes, enhancing revenue mobilization through modernized customs, broadened tax bases that spare the poorest, digitalization to reduce leakage, and rationalization of exemptions creates space for priority spending without unsustainable debt. On the expenditure side, results-based budgeting can discipline ministries to deliver measurable outputs rather than merely execute line items. Contingency buffers, including strategic reserves of gold or foreign exchange, can cushion shocks that would otherwise derail programs. If nationalization in the extractive sector increases gross receipts, these must be translated into visible improvements in public goods. If, conversely, investment lags and receipts dip, the state must be nimble enough to recalibrate without sacrificing core services. Infrastructure is the connective tissue of renewal. Roads that link farm to market restore livelihoods and strengthen state presence. Electrification anchors industry and powers clinics and schools. Digital networks knit citizens into a national conversation and expand opportunities for e-commerce, telemedicine, and remote learning. Here, sequencing matters. Generation without transmission, or transmission without distribution, yields stranded assets. Digitization without cybersecurity invites disruption. Procurement without competition invites waste. Each project should be evaluated on life cycle costs and social returns, with a bias toward labor-intensive methods, where feasible to maximize employment. Regional diplomacy will remain a proving ground for the new posture. The consolidation of the Sahel Confederation will test whether security cooperation can be made interoperable, whether customs regimes can be harmonized without paralyzing trade, and whether infrastructure corridors can be co-financed across borders that insurgents have treated with contempt. If the Confederation delivers early wins, such as synchronized border controls that speed illicit trade while impeding traffickers, it will build credibility that enables more ambitious steps, including energy pooling and coordinated industrial policy. The alternative is an inward turn that leaves each state to face transnational threats alone, a recipe for strategic exhaustion. International engagement will continue to judge Burkina Faso by a simple metric: do its policies, in the aggregate, expand the realm of possibility for its citizens? This test is practical rather than ideological. If security operations reduce displacement, reopen schools, and allow normal life to resume, they will be applauded. If resource reforms increase revenues that are transparently invested in public goods, they will be emulated. If diplomatic realignment yields technology transfer and capacity building rather than extractive bargains under a new flag, it will be respected. If, however, emergency measures calcify into permanent constraints on rights, if auxiliary forces act with impunity, if the press is muzzled and civil society marginalized, then whatever tactical victories have been won will be judged inadequate by the people whose trust sustains the state. The path forward is neither linear nor easy. It will demand from leadership the humility to course-correct, from security forces the professionalism to enforce discipline, from civil servants the diligence to implement policy, From traditional and religious leaders, the wisdom to reconcile. From entrepreneurs, the ingenuity to invest and create jobs. And from citizens, the perseverance to insist that the promise of sovereignty be measured by the quality of daily life. Success will not be a sudden unveiling of a new country, but a steady accumulation of tangible improvements. A school reopened here, a market bustling there, a repaired borehole, a functioning clinic, a road once feared now traveled without dread. This is the measure of a new Burkina Faso worthy of the name. It is a vision that honors the sacrifices already made by soldiers, volunteers, and civilians who have endured the brunt of a long and painful conflict. It is a vision that insists on dignity as the organizing principle of policy, not as a slogan, but as a method. It is a vision that understands sovereignty not as isolation, but as the freedom to choose partners and terms that advance the public interest. And it is a vision that recognizes that the only durable guarantee of stability is legitimacy earned daily by institutions that protect, serve, and listen. If the nation stays true to these first principles, the coming years can convert the rhetoric, renewal, into a lived reality. The work ahead is exacting, the stakes are high, and the world is watching. Yet the decisive gaze belongs not to distant observers but to the citizens who must decide, in homes and villages and neighborhoods, whether the state belongs to them and whether the future being built in their name is one they recognize as their own.